وإذا قيل لهم لا تفسدوا في الأرض قالوا إنما نحن مصلحون.
France has always been a state of contradiction. History is clear in that France is defined by a commitment to liberal values domestically and colonial conquest abroad. Liberty, fraternity, equality, for some but not for others. Let's take a deeper look. Addendum. This video will look at one specific example of this, which is France's extensive and brutal history of colonialism and war crimes. This is by no means exhaustive, as there are simply too many, and other colonial forces likewise did horrible things, but we're not comparing here. The purpose here is to highlight France's actions, particularly because its history is often glossed over, while it portrays itself as a global moral authority of sorts. We'll get to the other ones in the future, inshallah. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Fume. Ever find yourself reaching for an old habit? Now there's a better choice, one that's satisfying, refreshing, and guilt-free. Meet Fume. Fume isn't a vape or a pipe, it's an award-winning flavored air device that delivers pure taste to your mouth, not your lungs. That means no smoke, no vapor, and no nicotine. Just a healthier way to enjoy great flavors. With options like crisp mint and black licorice, there's something for everyone. But Fume isn't just about the taste, it's also a fidget-friendly tool with magnetic clicks to keep your hands busy and ease anxiety. Its sleek, solid design makes it easy to carry anywhere, plus it's more affordable than a bad habit. No batteries and no chargers. Quitting a bad habit suddenly can be tough on your brain. Fume helps by satisfying your hand-to-mouth instinct, easing nervous tension with its fidget-friendly design, and keeping you distracted with great-tasting flavors. Join over 300,000 people making the switch. Use my code Hakeem at checkout, and if you order the Journey Pack, you'll get a free Fume topper, a great add-on for your device. Visit tryfume.com/Hakeem or scan the QR code on your screen to get started today. That's tryfume.com/Hakeem, and don't forget to use my code for your exclusive deal. Sponsors have been scarce recently, so extra thanks to Fume for the sponsorship and allowing me to pay my editor fairly. Alright, back to the video. The roots of the Algerian War of Independence trace back to France's colonial conquest in 1830. When Algeria was violently annexed and integrated into French territory, with a military conquest lasting over 40 years before the country was officially deemed pacified. This conquest was accompanied by the genocide of nearly a third of the population by French forces, in which only then did Algeria become fully integrated as a settler colony. Let's briefly cover Algeria as a colony. France benefited greatly from exploiting Algeria, of course. Algeria's economy was subordinated to French needs, meaning dependent on exporting raw materials to France and importing manufactured goods from France. This was done in order to create a system of dependency, which of course led to the underdevelopment of local industries and infrastructure, leaving the Algerian economy incomplete post-independence. How was this done as a colony though? Well, as is typical for settler colonialism, France encouraged the migration of French settlers to Algeria, creating a European population that dominated every facet of Algerian existence, while simultaneously displacing or ethnically cleansing Algerians from their land. Algeria's fertile land was appropriated by French settlers, meaning French settlers showed up with the French military and kicked out the indigenous population, transforming them into large-scale agricultural enterprises useful only for French consumption, and forcibly integrating Algeria into the French economy. How? Well, through the usual sneaky ways of confiscating practically all fertile land under the pretext that it was vacant or underutilized land, which in both cases it wasn't. This was formalized through laws like the 1844 Law on Colonial Land and the 1873 Warnier Act, which transferred communal and tribal lands collectively used by Algerians for centuries into private French ownership. This was done in order to produce wine, wheat, and other agricultural goods for export to France, while local Algerians were reduced to sharecroppers or menial workers on their own land. French settlers likewise damaged the land by overexploitation and the use of European cash crops, displacing traditional Algerian farming methods and crops like barley and olives. How did the French farm these lands, however? Simply through Algerian labor, of course. The French colonial government imposed heavy taxes on Algerians, with the intention of forcing Algerians to work for French settlers or in French-owned industries to pay these taxes. The Indigenous Code Law likewise institutionalized discriminatory practices, including forced labor. Other colorful parts of the law included collective fines, involuntary property confiscation, and imprisonment without a trial for things like gathering without permission, criticizing colonial rule, or not showing enough respect to French officials, whatever that could mean. These punishments were carried out arbitrarily and without judicial oversight. More on labor though. During tough times in France, many Algerians were recruited as migrant workers to France, particularly during World War I and World War II, where they worked in factories and mines under brutal conditions for pennies on the dollar. Likewise, Algeria's strategic location in the Mediterranean allowed France to secure trade routes beneficial to their own economic interests and to act as a military base from which it could project power into the rest of Africa, specifically Tunisia and Morocco. Algeria's mineral wealth, including iron, phosphates, and oil, was systematically exploited by French companies. These resources were extracted using essentially unpaid Algerian labor and immediately exported to fuel France's industrial development. Profits solely flowed to France, with the only investment in Algerian infrastructure going to whatever France needed to continue extracting wealth from Algeria, including rail lines and ports. In fact, infrastructure projects would entirely and intentionally bypass Algerian communities, instead focusing on areas of economic importance to France or French settlers. These same French mining companies, with state support, heavily polluted the land with little regard for the environmental or social impact on local communities. Throughout all of this, the conquest of Algeria was framed as a civilizing mission, a cute name for colonialism and ethnic cleansing. This civilizing mission, as we've shown, conveniently only benefited French industry and French settlers in Algeria, to the total economic, social, and political exclusion and subordination of Algerians. By World War II, after decades of anti-colonial resistance by the Algerians, there was a general sense of disillusionment among Algerian political movements because of a pattern of unfulfilled reform promises from the French side. At the same time, France was more militarily vulnerable than ever. Of course, this was after World War II. The atmosphere was primed for liberation, and the war's formal beginning came on November 1st, 1954. With coordinated attacks by the National Liberation Front, known as the FLN, against colonial infrastructure across Algeria. Their broad goal was the independence of Algeria, and initially these attacks were small-scale and received little support. The conflict reached a tipping point in August of 1955, though. The FLN launched widespread offensives again, this time with significant help from civilians. This was the beginning of their war of liberation, following over a century of colonialism and ruthless exploitation. They targeted centers of power like military barracks and city halls, and these attacks resulted in the killing of over 100 French soldiers and settlers. The French forces retaliated and escalated, massacring around 10,000 Algerian civilians in response. These abuses unsurprisingly increased support for the FLN amongst Algerians, sparking widespread public resistance that later defined the war and allowed the FLN to become a significant fighting force. What defined the Algerian war from this point, however, was the systemic use of the most extreme violence by the French. Torture was a favorite tool of the French, often involving methods like beating, waterboarding, and electrocution. Sexual violence was also rampant, both against civilian women and as a form of torture for prisoners. The French military indiscriminately targeted civilians in their attacks, sometimes burning entire towns to the ground, with the intention of forcibly displacing Algerian civilians. In a few short years, nearly 1/3 of Algeria's rural population was put into detention camps in hopes of quelling the popular resistance to French colonialism. Prisoners were routinely executed and their bodies were disposed of through incineration or dumping into the sea from helicopters. Some prisoners were thrown from helicopters into the sea alive as a method of execution. In urban areas, French forces focused solely on mass arrests, surveillance, and torture. Even after the war, France abandoned many of the fairly few indigenous populations it had recruited for support during the conflict, with de Gaulle calling them a magma which has served no purpose and which it was necessary to get rid of without delay. Goes to show that being a traitor never pays. This brutal method of war even extended to France itself. The Paris massacre of 1961 saw French police kill hundreds of peaceful Algerian protesters, many of which were thrown into the River Seine to drown. I don't care if I mispronounce that. It's French, it's a waste of time. Despite France's military superiority though, diplomacy was the decisive factor. The FLN internationalized their struggle, drawing global attention to French atrocities in the region. By 1962, international pressure and domestic unrest forced France into negotiations, which resulted in Algeria's independence, alhamdulillah. While Algeria did win, the war was costly, resulting in unknown hundreds of thousands dead and millions displaced, a shattered societal structure, and a legacy of trauma. In France, the war revealed the immorality of its colonial ambitions, despite a relatively enthusiastic French public for colonialism, particularly in Algeria, mostly because of economic benefits. Public revelations of torture and mass killings, however, caused outrage from some sections of French society, particularly the left wing, but also religious writers. One French politician compared the events in Algeria to his own experience as a POW in Nazi-occupied Paris, a sentiment shared by others. In response to criticism, the French state continued and continues to censor evidence and discussion of the atrocities committed, and downplays the conflict as much as possible. In 2001, a memoir was published by Paul, I'm not going to pronounce his stupid last name, who at the time was a French general. In it, he admitted to multiple war crimes, including torture and summary executions, and alleged that this was supported by top levels of the French government. He also argued, like the absolute ghoul that he is, that this was a good thing. NGOs attempted to rightly prosecute him for war crimes because he is a war criminal, but this was dismissed on the grounds of a previous French government amnesty for anyone involved in Algeria. How convenient. His only punishments were a €7,500 fine and losing his military honors. The issue is this fine was for defending the use of war crimes, not the committing them part. Despite the revelations, France didn't formally recognize the systemic use of torture until 2018. Their recognition is worth less than the paper it's written on. Mostly because it's written in French. Madagascar was another French colony. The French had occupied the island in 1895, requiring 8 years of brutal pacification to solidify control. By the 20th century, Madagascar's economy and governance were firmly structured, much like Algeria's was, to benefit France. Malagasy labor and resources were exploited for French economic interests, while French settlers enjoyed their settler privileges. The oppressive indigenous code system granted French administrators unchecked authority over Malagasy lives, enforcing harsh punishments for minor so-called crimes much the same way as in Algeria, even up to military conscription policies being enforced on the native population. Let's take a deeper look. France, of course, began by systematically and illegally seizing Malagasy land, of course they did, reorienting the agricultural economy to serve French interests and prioritizing cash crops over local subsistence farming. They did this through an 1896 decree that declared all quote-unquote vacant and underutilized land to be state property. They of course got to decide which land is vacant or underutilized, regardless of who lived there and farmed the land. The confiscated land would then be redistributed amongst French settlers and companies, essentially for free. If you're missing the story here, Malagasy land was stripped of them and just handed to French settlers. This land was then used for cash crops, destroying the soil and causing food shortages for the native population. The native population was then subject to forced labor on French-owned farms and plantations, sometimes even on the same land they were dispossessed of, for little to no pay. Madagascar's incredibly biodiverse forests were heavily logged by the French for valuable hardwoods like ebony and rosewood, which were quickly exported to France for use in high-end furniture and construction. What was left was cleared for cash crop plantations of coffee, vanilla, and cloves. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in significant deforestation, desertification, and soil erosion, with Madagascar experiencing a 90% loss of its original forest cover since. Local mines and mineral resources were ruthlessly exploited for graphite and gold, with zero French investment in Madagascar or its native population, aside from railroads and ports used to send everything stolen from Madagascar to France. That's easily shown by where and what the French built. As an example, the Tananarive-Antsirabe Railway, built using forced labor, transported cash crops and minerals to the coast for export, while bypassing native communities entirely. Just as with Algeria, decades of this turned Madagascar into a supplier of low-cost raw materials for France and an importer of expensive finished French goods, in essence entrenching Malagasy underdevelopment long after independence. All of this too was framed as a civilizing mission, much like how the modern West continues to justify ethnic cleansing and indiscriminate bombing through appeals to human rights and democracy, of course through dead children. During World War II, British and Commonwealth forces occupied Madagascar, defeating the French forces present there. This became a symbol of French military vulnerability and inspired growing nationalist sentiments among the Malagasy people. Tensions erupted on the night of March 29, 1947, in a nationalist uprising sparked by widespread resentment over French exploitation. The insurgency was restricted to the island's southeastern region and mainly armed with machetes and spears, very few rifles, and at most 3 machine guns. France's response was swift and brutal, exemplifying the usual extreme measures colonial powers used to suppress dissent. Despite the lack of a serious threat from the uprising, entire villages were razed in retaliation, with widespread rape, torture, and summary executions by French forces. Thousands of Malagasy people fled into the forest to escape French violence, where many died because of starvation and disease. Death flights were also used here as a method of execution. Estimates of the death toll vary widely due to a climate of secrecy from France, in which only journalists approved by the French were allowed near the operational zones, essentially forcing all information through a military censor, much like Israel does. Regardless, one classified document put the death toll at 89,000 people. The political situation leading up to the French Indochina War is harder to simplify than Algeria and Madagascar. French colonial rule in the region began, again in the mid-19th century. They colonized the areas of modern Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, becoming Indochina. Vietnam specifically, however, was a hotbed of resistance, where nationalist resentment against French rule combined with emerging communist ideas after World War I. The collapse of France in 1940 during World War II strongly affected Indochina, with French authority in the region being severely weakened. Vietnam would proclaim a short-lived independence in an attempt to split from France, forming a government with non-communist nationalists. In October 1945, however, the French began their attempt to reassert control over Indochina, with them successfully capturing territory in the south. The Viet Minh, the insurgency force that had resisted the Japanese Empire, now resisted the French in hopes of having true independence, with help from neighboring China and the USSR, of course. The Viet Minh insurgents were heavily influenced by communism and especially Maoist guerrilla strategy, which they combined with Vietnamese nationalism, ideological education, and the mobilization of the peasantry to great effect. Unlike other examples, the Viet Minh had material support from various socialist nations, and a numerical advantage over French troops in the region. However, this doesn't mean that they were even close to equal. The Viet Minh were still extremely under-equipped compared to the French, and relied heavily on guerrilla warfare to achieve their success. The French operations during the Indochina War, in typical French fashion, systematically targeted civilian populations on the grounds that they were rooting out guerrilla forces. French troops, unable to directly engage the Viet Minh, relied on collective punishment instead, indiscriminately attacking villages on the smallest hint of suspicion. Even minor provocations, such as the discovery of pro-independence materials or the loss of a soldier to guerrilla tactics, would often escalate into horrific violence, including the bombing and burning of entire villages and indiscriminate killing of civilians regardless of age or gender. Torture again became a common practice for French forces, along with rape and summary executions. Aren't the French lovely? The French would take part in horrific acts of mutilation by putting decapitated heads on sticks, cutting off body parts, and collecting souvenirs off of Vietnamese bodies. The French public was mostly unaware of all this. Unlike the people of Vietnam, civilians in France were never subjected to the same violence, which is yet another example of the asymmetry between the two sides. The colonial war remained a distant and abstract concept for most of France, and so, without domestic accountability and even some tacit support from the French public for colonial activities, the atrocities continued. This would change in early 1954, however, when the French military suffered an especially humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu, a French military stronghold and airbase, which was extremely well fortified, containing a large garrison and was a point of pride for the French military. Its outer defenses were overtaken by the Viet Minh, who then set up anti-aircraft weapons that were dug into a hillside overseeing the base, allowing them to fire over the airstrip. This meant that the garrison was besieged and could not receive reinforcements. This defeat led to a massive collapse in support for the war in France. Shortly after, the French government changed and the new Prime Minister, Pierre Mendes, signed a quick peace treaty and opened up negotiations with the Viet Minh. A ceasefire deal was reached, but, with American insistence, as always, Vietnam was left divided into two states, cut along the middle. This short peace period saw France leave the region, and the US coming in instead. The most significant political legacy of the First Indochina War was that it ultimately led to the Second Indochina War, more commonly known as the Vietnam War, which likewise the resilient and heroic people of Vietnam triumphed in, despite massive loss of life. The question that's missing here is, why did the French do this? French atrocities in this period actively worked against military efficiency. They often served no military purpose, such as sexual crimes or civilian killings. They often helped to radicalize the population against the French, giving support to insurgencies. In these examples, France had such overwhelming military power that there was no need to resort to war crimes. Neither were these atrocities random occurrences or retaliatory one-offs. They were systematic and so must have served some purpose. This purpose was psychological warfare. They were acts of colonial terrorism that aimed to cause as much fear and mental harm as possible, to break the will of these populations and force their submission. It's part of a distinctly colonial mindset that prioritizes control and fear at all costs, and sees other races as subhumans to be trained. Death flights are a clear example of this. Military helicopters were actively redirected from providing a concrete strategic advantage and used instead to make someone's final moments terrifying. There's a reason that it was a tactic favored by the military dictatorships in Argentina and Chile. It is a technique of exerting control over a population, not combating a military enemy. It was simply colonial suppression, in response not to the methods of the insurgencies, but to their fundamental goal of independence. Regardless, whatever a colonized nation does in order to win its liberation is inherently justified. The colonizing nation imposed violence on itself and the colony when it started colonizing. Ceasing colonial activities and leaving is a clear condition for peace. You can never blame the victim for resisting unspeakable violence and economic exploitation. From this perspective, France's actions can be better understood. They seemed so intentionally cruel and vicious because they were going out of their way to be as harmful as possible. Through pain and humiliation, the constant targeting of civilians, the sexual crimes and mutilations, their true targets were not the insurgents themselves, but the entire people of these nations that supported the insurgencies and the will for independence. France's war crimes during its resistance to decolonization followed clear patterns of brutality driven by a colonial mindset that prioritized control and fear over military efficiency. The parallel with Israeli war crimes in Palestine is hard to miss, because it's the same playbook from the same European ethno-supremacist mindset. While we've only covered a few of France's many conflict zones and war crimes, it's enough to see the patterns of how the French military and government operated during this period, and would continue doing if they had the power to. In Algeria, Madagascar, and Indochina, French forces committed a similar selection of war crimes: the indiscriminate targeting of civilians in settlements, widespread torture, and sexual warfare. These crimes were at an extreme scale and across the globe for several decades straight. These methods were standard practice, being utilized at the slightest provocation. France's overly harsh retaliation repeatedly escalated the conflicts and worsened the humanitarian situation, while also worsening France's own military situation. All these crimes were committed directly by the French military, and in some ways, permitted by the French state at the highest level. During the post-World War II period, regardless of the attitudes of the French public, the French state continued to act with brutal disregard for human rights despite their supposed egalitarianism and enlightened liberal values. Their atrocities tore apart societies and caused long-term impacts still relevant today. All this was done to uphold the already inhumane system of colonial domination France had helped to establish for the profits of the smallest sliver of French capital and for the living standards of the French population, before of course capital began cannibalizing their quality of life as well. Similar forms of exploitation continue to this day in unending French neocolonialism over their former colonies. As long as empire continues to exploit and terrorize, resistance will continue and will emerge victorious, inshallah. A better world is possible. That's all for today. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, that really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.